My name's Jeff Knopf. I'm faculty here at the Monterey Institute, and I serve as the chair of our master's degree program in Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, a rare summer seminar, but we're taking advantage of the fact that she's here visiting family at the moment, although she studies in the UK. This is Janani Mohan. She's currently a PhD student at the University of Cambridge in the UK, where she is in the hopefully home stretch of completing her doctoral dissertation. But she's from nearby, originally in the Bay Area, did her undergrad degree at UC Berkeley and a master's degree at Stanford, and also has some interesting Washington, D.C. Work experience, including a prior internship at the U.S. State Department, some time at one of our sister research centers, the Stimson Center on their South Asia program. She's going to talk to us today about parts of her doctoral dissertation research, strategy or scramble, security implications of emerging technologies in nuclear energy. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to start this off by first thanking the center for having me here, Lauren for organizing, Jeff for the invite, and just it's really wonderful to sort of see all the work coming out of the center here, and it's something that motivates me as a researcher to keep going in this space, to see all the incredible outputs from here. So I really appreciate being here and being able to hopefully share some interesting insights from my research and then get interesting questions, feedback, and a conversation going. So, okay, yeah, how'd that work? But just very briefly about me, that was a great introduction. So I just want to quickly mention what my PhD is about, because it focuses a little bit more broadly than what we're talking about today, but this is a really, really important aspect of that. So my PhD is looking at strategic efforts to address security and safety risks at civilian nuclear power plants. I engage extensively with case studies in the United Kingdom, France, Japan, and India. So I've spent a bit of time on the ground in all of those different locations. And then I very briefly wanted to sort of thank my supervisor, Stephen Ward, and the University of Cambridge for supporting my visit out here. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and dive in. What we have on the screen here are 5 different attacks. Attacks on civilian nuclear power plants as part of conflict, retaliatory attack to deter future attacks, insider threat at civilian nuclear power plants, poor security culture practices at civilian nuclear power plants, cyber attacks at civilian nuclear power plants. Now, the reason this is so interesting to me is all 5 of these have, in fact, occurred at various plants in the past year. And I think that just sort of brings the modern relevance of the questions that we see today when we think about emerging technology and the role it's playing at within some of these attacks. Now, attacks on civilian nuclear power plants is not a new issue. There have been attacks by non-state actors on these plants over the past few decades. We can think about the attack, for example, at Super Phoenix in France by environmentalists, and sort of that was like 1980s, I believe, and sort of there's been those types of elements before. There's also been state actor attacks on nuclear facilities. However, those facilities have often been for enrichment or proliferation purposes, so not really falling under the civilian nuclear power plant, nuclear energy generation field. So what we're seeing really new in recent times is this sort of shift to having state actors looking at attacking civilian nuclear plants or thinking about this as sort of part of their doctrines. Now, the examples on this slide here actually come from a lot of different places around the world, and I think that's important to highlight. Attack on civilian nuclear power plants as part of conflict, Ukraine, we can think of Zaporizhia in that instance. The retaliatory attack to deter future attacks from the past year is a good example of that, is sort of Iran's attack on the Barakah power plant in the UAE. It was not a successful attack, but it was sort of seen as part of perhaps a strategy to deter future attacks. There is the insider threat element that happened, which specifically there was an incident involving a USB port that was taken in by an employee and plugged into a system within a nuclear power plant. Now, again, nothing happened, thankfully, and that's because of proactive air gapping in that facility. And that was, there was an incident of that. Poor security culture practices, a really good instance of this in the sort of the past year has been access to a site, and that was actually in Japan, that occurred where someone took an ID that wasn't theirs. They were, in fact, an employee at the same site, but they used an ID that wasn't theirs to get onto the site. And so it's sort of those types of issues that can be seen as well. And then the cybersecurity attacks is something that, although not officially spoken about by any of these countries, sort of unofficially has occurred at several sites in the past year. And so that's quite concerning to sort of hear about that and to hear about the potential risk. So that's just a quick anecdotal starting point, but what really stands out to me as a researcher when I look at this is sort of, we see all of these new emerging technologies, whether from a defense perspective or a cyber technology perspective, being utilized in these attacks. And so it sort of leads to a question of, are we really looking at new attacks? Are we looking at new attacks that are being enabled by new tech? So my research today, and sort of the question I want to focus on, is how do states strategize against attacks on nuclear energy, so civilian nuclear power plants specifically, in an environment characterized by emerging technologies. But we have to break that down quite a bit. So the first bit that I want to focus on is actually what is unique about attacks on civilian nuclear power plants. And that's what that first slide got to a bit, so I'm going to be a little bit brief on this, but there's 5 ways that we can think about this uniqueness factor when we're thinking about how there are new strategies being used and new technologies being utilized in the sector. The first is that nuclear energy is falling at the civil nuclear intersection. So it's a critical national infrastructure on par with examples to other sort of power plants. But at the same time, there's this potential nuclear radioactive effect. And so this means it sits at the intersection of 2 distinct policy conversations and areas. The second element is that often attacks on these facilities are viewed as being sort of potentially part of some sort of escalation in a nuclear sense. And I mean, it does fall below the nuclear use threshold, but it can perhaps be strategized and thought about as escalating, or perhaps as sort of being some sort of nuclear posturing element to a certain degree. The third element is that the security as a country whose facilities might be under attack, often the facilities and the security conceptualization at those facilities are happening from outside the military. So often the security personnel are from a regulatory agency, from other agencies, but not from the military itself. And so that's a little bit interesting when compared to nuclear weapons and other nuclear policy elements. The fourth is sort of this perception that attacks on civilian nuclear power plants have a very low likelihood, and it's obviously been changing recently, but there has been a historic perception that this would not happen. And that sort of leads to the fifth point of why that historic perception has existed, and that has to do with international norms. Now, nuclear power plant attacks sit at a very interesting space within the international norm environment, because it's not entirely civilian and it's not entirely nuclear. So there needs to be a set of specific norms related to attacking these plants. Possibly the most information-heavy slide in this entire deck, I promise. But this is sort of the norms landscape that we can think about when thinking about specifically attacks on civilian nuclear power plants. The norms, I would say, sort of primarily come from sort of this additional protocols to the Geneva Convention, which prevent attacks on civilian nuclear power plants, but there are 2 key exceptions, and I think that has left a lot of space for these norms to be weakened over time. So the first exception is that it only prevents attacks if those attacks may release dangerous forces and impacts on civilian populations. And the second exception is that if that nuclear power plant is providing electrical support to a military installation, and the only way to sort of stop that military power generation and support were to attack the plant, that would be an exemption. And so I think this is where we see a lot of the weakening of norms coming about, is the fact that even in this one sort of international document that discusses it, it's not, there's clear exemptions, there's clear room for negotiating this in different ways. Just very quickly on the slide as well, I want to talk briefly about the other ways that we see international norms growing in this space, because I think it's relevant when we think about sort of where the norms gap is, and specifically how that gap ends up now then filtering into conversations around emerging technologies. We have norms reinforcement from the IAEA, and this is specifically post-Ukraine. So there's the 7 pillars and 5 principles post-Ukraine that discuss attacks on nuclear energy sites. There's also, however, interestingly, and I think this is sort of one of those interesting points to bring in because it works both ways, but attacks on, when countries have carried out attacks on sites for the purposes of non-proliferation. So we think about an attack against a potential enrichment reactor. Those attacks have sort of always been coached in terms of, well, we attacked a site, but there was really there was very limited fissile material, there were low radioactive risks, perhaps there was no fissile material at those sites. And although in some ways you can say that's sort of violating norms about attacking specific infrastructure, in other ways it's sort of ironically also reinforcing this norm against attacking a site that has fissile material, which would include civilian nuclear power plants. Other derivations of norms that we could potentially claim include things like environmental law, humanitarian law, as well as certain justifications from the anti-nuclear weapons test laws that exist in international law, because they use a lot of language surrounding radioactive effects on civilians. And so it's bringing all of that together that we can argue there's some sort of international norm against these attacks at civilian nuclear power plants. Now, this is where we start to switch now into how does all of this relate to this technology conversation and where technology might fit in. And the way that it does is if we think about all these international norms as having existed for, let's say, the past, 33 decades, 4 decades, and then we think about all the attacks that are happening or that have been planned or thought about or could potentially happen in sort of this current geopolitical environment, international norms seem to be substantially weakening and perhaps even failing to prevent attacks on civilian nuclear power plants. So there is a certain question that arises from this of what is this norm, like what is causing this norm's weakening, and specifically where does this sort of slot in with the way that we as state actors conceptualize how to prevent these attacks. So specifically, what my PhD proposes is that there's this resilience environment paradox. A lot of the norms that exist internationally, historically, focus on environmental consequences and this perception that there are these radioactive effects from attacks on nuclear energy facilities. However, to address that, and this goes to the first point in that cycle over there, states attempt to address it by increasing and building resilience. And one of the big ways they do this is by utilizing resilience-enabling technologies. However, as they use these technologies to improve resilience, what ends up happening is it enables a space for certain limited scope attacks to occur at these facilities, as well as potentially reduces the radioactive effects, or at least the perception of radioactive effects at these facilities. Especially if we think about the fact that, for instance, with the types of very high-level strategic targeting that can happen, an operator sitting around the world could target a very specific building at a nuclear power plant without necessarily hitting the fissile material, and they could potentially look into that. So there are these types of risks that emerge. And so as the environmental consequences and the perception of these decrease in terms of these norms surrounding it, and part of that decrease is happening because of resilience, states then look at more resilience-enabling technologies to prevent that decrease. This leads to sort of a need to increase resilience in state nuclear energy apparatuses without, in a way that outpaces this increase in these sub-threshold attacks that we see. And so this is where this emerging technology question, I think, really becomes very important to conversation. It's important here to categorize emerging technology uses as sort of two uses that we can see and engage on that in this context of attacks on civil nuclear power plants. The first context is resilience-enabling technologies, and we can think about these as having sort of 4 key outcomes that states are looking for. The first is security by design. So when we think about Gen 4 reactors, advanced reactors, small modular reactors, how do these new builds enable inherent security, inherent resilience by design? The second element is intrinsic risk reduction. And although nuclear fusion is sort of further out there, there is this idea that certain types of nuclear energy production could inherently reduce risks. And so sort of how that plays into enabling resilience in the long term is something that's being considered. And then the third and fourth factors here is precision and capability, and everything with regards to artificial intelligence and cyber, and even, for example, more precise construction machinery it relates to improving a state's resilience via precision and capability. And so that's all on the positive side of how emerging technology can really help the space. But there's this, certain negative side as well that is what's of really growing concern in the space. So the first element of that is sort of the fact that attack enabling technologies can improve, or improve seems to be a bad term to use here because it gives a certain positivity to it, but it can enable sort of ease of attacks. And what we specifically mean by that is artificial intelligence, for example, enables a high amount of data analysis that could ease the level of the capability of certain bad actors to be able to attack plants. The second objective that we see in this is also the fact that attack enabling technologies enable distance. And that is a critical problem because instead of an attacker necessarily having to be near a facility or in proximity to a facility, they could be sitting around the world and still be able to sort of carry out and exploit certain vulnerabilities. And that sort of leads to this third objective as well, which sits sort of at this nexus between resilience enabling and attack enabling technologies, which is that as states utilize more technology and more advancements, and as supply chains grow more complex and interconnected, there is the ability of sort of these attack enabling technologies to exploit vulnerabilities at several chain stops within the supply chain. So so technology, I just want to highlight here that technology never falls into just one of these two categories. You're always going to see that it's sort of complex and can fall into either category. And because of that, it means that we just need to be thinking about how can we utilize resilience enabling technologies faster and in a better and more effective way than the opposing side can perhaps be utilizing attack enabling technologies. So the other quick thing to note about this is which attackers are actually looking at enabling technologies, because I think it's very easy to sort of say, you know, blue team, red team, which I guess the color coding here doesn't help discourage, but it's, it can be, I think, a bit more complex than that. So we do have states with nuclear energy programs saying we were interested in resilience enabling technologies, but on the attack enabling side, there's both non-state actors who can be ideologically driven or financially motivated, and then on the attack enabling side, in terms of when state actors are interested in attack enabling technologies. They could be doing it during a conflict as part of their conflict strategy. They could be doing it as more of an informational purpose of data collection. And we sort of see this interestingly in two ways. One is to collect data on the attacked country in terms of their state status and their state capacity. And the other is to capacity build themselves. And that often sort of ties into perhaps some proliferation elements. Just quickly on this, I don't really look at non-proliferation reasoning as perhaps part of a reason why a state would carry out or utilize attack enabling technology. And that's because I focus specifically on civilian nuclear power plants, and those attacks would arguably be happening against enrichment reactors, which does not fall within this research. Great. So now that we've sort of laid out all of the possible landscapes and problems, I think one of the things to think about here is just why it's so difficult from a state perspective in terms of preventing attacks. And it's just because it's incredibly, incredibly complex, because as we look at sort of these attack enabling technologies and what they actually mean in practice, it means that these attacks can be coming from any location, any actor, any method. And the specific thing I want to note here is any actor includes both internal and external actors. And I think that leads to sort of a very complex environment where people believe, perhaps inaccurately, that some of these attack enabling technologies could protect them from getting any blowback from the attack because it might shield who they are in a way that was not necessarily possible before. So it sort of expands the sense of where these attacks can be coming from when we think of an attack enabling technology and its potential use, and then also expands the sense of where responses would need to occur. So based off of all of this, when states are thinking about technology, and specifically how can they be utilizing some of these emerging technologies, most state actors are thinking of emerging technology as falling within this resilience category. So resilience enabling, and this is how we as a state actor can utilize this technology. Now, what's interesting if we think about this in terms of an attack timeline is that states are really trying to prevent that attack from occurring. And so as it builds up to an attack, they've put most of their technology, or thinking about most of their technology strategy at that level. Now, what's interesting is that as an attacker of these facilities, or sort of in terms of if you are a sort of a malicious actor looking at how to impact these facilities, you're also thinking about the technologies that states are using, and you're saying, okay, the technologies I'm up against and the physical security I'm up against at the state has primarily been thought about at this resilience level. And so given that there is this really interesting interaction between so-called attack enabling technologies and resilience enabling technologies, it's really important for states to have a strategy that ensures that resilience enabling technologies are outpacing attack enabling technologies. Because the idea is that bad actors might be using attack enabling technologies to sort of break through that resilience barrier. And so if we're trying to understand what an effective strategy needs to look like around proactively utilizing resilience-enabling technologies. There's four sort of areas that we really need to understand as part of this and that states need to strategize around. And it does kind of involve states strategizing across all four of these, not just in a specific space. So the first one is that states need to have the governance structures that support a quick and efficient adoption of resilience-enabling technology, but also that support quick and efficient responses to attack-enabling technology. The second one is that states need to have public-private partnerships that, again, enable those two outcomes. And specifically with public-private partnerships, it's a very careful balance of having a certain level of trust. You need, the company or the operator to trust you as a state, but you also need to have a certain level of authority to hold an industry accountable to certain standards. So it's an interesting mix of being a friend, but also a boss at the same time. And so sort of bringing those two together. The third category is emerging technology strategy. And this is something that can be actually quite complex. So specifically whether states actually have a clearly internally stated strategy in terms of the adoption of resilience enabling technologies. And that is, we'll get to that in a moment, but it is quite a difficult topic that often comes up. And then the fourth element is human reliability strategy. Are states effectively considering security, culture, security mindsets, how to adopt these practices throughout the workforce, as well as how to have the correct skill set in the workforce to enable the use of technology at a fast enough rate. So breaking this down really quickly on this, I'm not going to go into my methodology at all. I just want to say what it sort of involves at a high level is going across my 4 case studies, talking to people in government extensively, doing regulatory review extensively, and then sort of getting an understanding of where various states are within this. And based on those interviews, this is where these 4 categories have emerged as what states would need to be able to adequately adopt resilience enabling technology. So the first is governance structures. I think the thing that's interesting with governance structures is that every state does it differently. So there's definitely not like one prescribed method to get there, but there are certain elements that states have to consider in order to make sure that they are able to generate an appropriate technology strategy. And so the first element, and if you look at like the case study of France specifically, it's sort of thinking through who the strategist is within a state, who the regulator is within a state, and who is the expertise within the state. And states will place different organizations at different spaces in this. France specifically places the ministries, so specifically the ministries under the prime minister, for example, and presidents, under this ministry for the ecological transition and an inter-ministry for new nuclear as a strategist. Now, what's interesting is strategists are only normally looking at the industry from an economics perspective. They're thinking about energy as a means of serving an energy need. That's their primary perspective. But there are elements that often touch upon sort of this broader conversation about security as well at times. Now, the regulator for safety is often also the regulator for security in a lot of these contexts. And what's really important, or what France has done recently, is it's merged its expertise, so its scientific expertise, with the regulator, which I think is actually quite interesting, because as it merged IRSN and ASN into ASNR, one of the things it's done is it's brought some of the expertise about technology into the regulator. So before, research that was being done on, for example, AI modeling and simulating some of certain issues that could arise at plants, et cetera, would not have necessarily been occurring directly under ASNR, but now some of that modeling, some of that research is now directly occurring under the authority for regulation. And so that'll be sort of interesting to see how that plays out, but it's a type of conversation that needs to occur. The second element, and I just want to quickly check how we're doing on time. Okay, good. Okay, great, perfect. The second element is public-private partnerships. We talked about this careful balance between trust and being an authority figure still. And I think that's sort of the biggest difficulty that any government can face in the partnership, is maintaining the level of trust where industry is coming to government when they have an issue, but also is being held accountable for those issues in a productive way. The United Kingdom is very interesting in this space because they actually very uniquely use a goals-based approach in terms of how they regulate industry instead of a prescriptive approach. So in most countries, you're sort of providing specific requirements to the private sector in terms of how to achieve certain safety standards and certain security standards and outcomes. In the UK, they provide the objectives to the private sector. They say, here are the goals, and you can sort of work out how best to implement it. Now, in practice, it might result in very similar results between industry, whether you're in the UK or in a more prescriptive model. But in terms of providing a certain level of trust to industry, this could arguably be perhaps better at creating that sort of that trusted relationship. Now, the consequence of this as well, of course, is that UK inspectors are often have to be much more active on sites and have to sort of be on that ground, like much more connected into industry. But I do think that can also honestly be an advantage to some degree if we think about integrating and sort of making sure that this partnership is able to support specifically the adoption of an emerging technology strategy. Which leads us to sort of the core thing that we can think about, which is emerging technology strategy, and is the government having a strategy for the adoption of our resilience-enabling technologies and for preventing attack-enabling technologies. And so we put both of those into conversation together, and as we do that, we realize, I mean, if you sort of look through the case studies that I've been exploring, a lot of them are and this is true of a lot of nuclear energy programs, but the operators are typically sort of sitting outside of government. We are looking at a public-private partnership, and that can, in part, mean that government might be reluctant to go to industry and tell them, hey, these are the specific technologies we want to see you adopting because we think these specific resilience-enabling technologies will improve security. That's something that government's very reluctant to do in most cases. Part of the reasoning about this is actually because a regulator and a regulating authority does not want to tell industry what to do in that sense. Industry should be coming to them with the technologies that they use, and then they simply assess to see, is this secure enough? Is this safe enough? And so that's sort of the ethos behind that relationship that exists almost everywhere in the world. But in countries where the operator is situated within the public sphere, and as the operator is more integrated into the public sphere, in those countries, we do see perhaps a further push in terms of the direction of which way technologies can be adopted. So India is actually an interesting case study for this because their operator, NPCIL, is government, and so they're also very heavily tied into sort of the direction setting that the government department sets for it. And so at multiple levels in India, there are conversations sort of happening regarding energy technology adoption. There are the research centers that happen at the Department of Atomic Energy, which works very closely with NPCIL to sort of on specific elements, but they do have research centers that are, for example, discussing the adoption of a thorium fuel cycle and fusion and various other technology adoptions. And I think specifically with thorium, it's very interesting because part of that conversation is about securing the supply chain in India. And so it brings it back to how can specific advancements in nuclear energy help improve resilience by supply chain securing. Atomic Energy Commission in India also plays a role. They do have these discussions. They advise policymakers with regard specifically to adopting resilience-enabling technologies. And it sort of builds all the way up to the Prime Minister's office, where there also seems to be a certain level of discussion going on. Now, whether this discussion filters down into practice is a separate point, but in terms of the discussions happening, it is able to happen a little bit more because of the integration of the operator into government. And that's not necessarily a positive because there could be downsides of that as well. So it's just to sort of situate. But in this specific context, we do see more conversation happening on this, perhaps as a lever because of that. In terms of the fourth category that states also need to have to ensure that they're adopting technology effectively, this is the human reliability strategy. Human reliability speaks to insider threats. It speaks to whether the threat is coming from that external versus insider for certain, but it also speaks to the adoption of technologies in an appropriate way. And there's specifically a gap in artificial intelligence skill sets and knowledge, as well as cyber knowledge that has been needing to get addressed quite significantly in various countries in the past 2 to 3 years. So we're seeing a very sudden boom in needing these skills. Human reliability is often contextualized in terms of security culture and security culture practices. And I think a good example of thinking about how states are looking at adopting better security culture, better culture related to technical skill sets, et cetera, is in the context of Japan, just because they've done extensive work on the safety culture side recently. And so we can see the way that they have adopted it as perhaps a method for states to move towards better practices surrounding security, culture, and technology adoption as well. So post-Fukushima Daiichi incident in Japan, there were numerous safety culture surveys that occurred. And it sort of led to this idea that there needs to be both a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, which has been sort of utilized throughout the world, but they talk about it really sort of extensively in that context, where you can have a regulatory approach. The regulator needs to have sort of ongoing conversations with industry to understand the vulnerabilities in culture related to the adoption of some of these new technologies, as well as reporting approach. So where people who are more junior feel empowered to report their seniors if there is some sort of issue that comes up in terms of, again, not only the adoption of technology specifically, but other security related vulnerabilities as well. This leads us back to that top level question. How can resilience building and resilience enabling technologies actually outpace an attack enabling technology threat? And so there's two bits to focus on here. In terms of reinforcing resilience building, all of the resilience building efforts have to sort of be thought through and conceptualized, very specific to the attack enabling technology and the specific impacts of various attack enabling technologies. So for example, we can have better information control to reduce data inputs for attack enabling AI models. We could have better verification across the supply chain, as well as bringing supply chains to more allied-based places. And this is regardless of which state we're sitting in, but it's sort of the general practice that states should be adopting. Also, access control is a very, very big problem, and this speaks back to sort of that cautionary story I started off with the ID that was used to access a facility. That would almost be an instance of authorized access control, but just used poorly. But there's also instances of unauthorized access control as well that could be perhaps further strategized against. Now, in terms of also minimizing the attack enabling threat, a really important element here is to consider norms strengthening. Norms reinforcement is actually not enough, because if we go back to sort of the conversation around the international norms that exist, they are not strong enough to prevent the types of attacks that attack enabling technologies can do, which are these limited scope warfare attacks. They can be highly precise, precision based, etc. So they might not be enough. And in general, cyber threats as well have been considered to sort of sit beyond some of those international norms to a certain degree. So beyond norms reinforcement, we actually need norms strengthening to sort of weaken the capacity for attack enabling technology, especially by state actors, to occur, because as we strengthen these norms, state actors tend to sort of be more constrained by those norms and perhaps more reluctant to use some of these technologies. When we think about that in practice, and this is actually just an example of sort of how we can think about it in practice, so I'm just going to focus on one here, but the idea is when we think about it from a state perspective in practice, we're just considering what sort of obstacles exist in the state currently under these four categories and what sort of opportunities exist in the state currently, and then thinking about how to move one to the other. And I think a great example of this is the public-private partnerships, and specifically that there is this, and as well as human reliability strategy, and specifically this tech skills gap that I mentioned earlier. There's a huge gap where sort of employees might not know how to use artificial intelligence effectively, and the way that it's being filtered down currently to be responsible, because artificial intelligence obviously is something that we can't just dump into decision making. It has to be a tool, not a decision maker in itself. And so the way that it's being adopted currently, especially for example in the UK, they'll do the trainings at management level. It'll be a handful, a few people at like senior level who are learning how to use AI. So the skills gap is going to take a while to sort of fully work its way through, because we have to adopt some of these emerging technologies responsibly. So in the meantime, where can we sort of fix that gap or think about resilience enabling is the security expertise gap. There's really great security expertise that I think exists in critical national infrastructure industries, as well as in sort of governmental practices, mindsets. And so some of that expertise, some of that skill set could help sort of address that gap until that gap shrinks properly. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of conceptualize where certain elements that are intrinsic already in state systems could be seen as an opportunity to address some of the obstacles that are sort of identified when thinking about technology adoption. So very briefly, conclusions, strategy or scramble is sort of what I started off with. The question that I have on my mind is whether states are strategically thinking about these issues effectively, or whether it's sort of been a scramble in the past few years, whether it's a scramble also retroactively once an attack occurs to sort of address why that attack happened, how can it be prevented the next time, etc. The answer to whether states currently seem to be in a strategic mindset or a scrambling mindset is a little bit of both, and it really varies by state. So this is sort of averaging or kind of talking about some patterns seen rather than saying this is true for all states. But in general, in terms of governance structures and public-private partnerships, there seems to be some strategy. It just has not been tailored for technology specifically. But in terms of whether states have a strategy to adopt resilience-enabling technology or to secure human reliability for technology adoption, that seems to be the spaces that have the largest vulnerabilities currently in terms of state strategy. So what my PhD sort of looks at next and continues on is how to assess the effectiveness of the strategy in each country in a comparable context, again, looking at these 4 case studies, and then also how to assess what an ideal strategy must account for. And that sort of is sort of like a policy, more of a policy implication than a theoretical implication on that. But, you know, I think it's really important for states to have sort of a plan in terms of emerging technologies that is not necessarily specific to a technology, because there's a great breadth of what an emerging technology can be, and there's a great breadth in terms of the security risks, but also benefits it can bring about. But in terms of what is there, is we know that there's always going to be emerging technologies. There's always going to be some new technology. And so the question is, how can states just make sure that their structures are ready for whatever the new technology could be? Could be artificial intelligence and AI, it could be something new that we haven't quite discovered yet. So with that, thank you very much. Really appreciate you all taking the time to listen today. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to any feedback.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll turn to questions in a second, but just to make sure that we properly thank our speaker for a very comprehensive and well-organized talk, let's do an initial thank you right here. Thanks for sticking exactly to the suggested time parameters and for having a shot at Big Sur for us to...
You know, it was either this, it was a hard choice. I had to decide between a nuclear power plant on like a very cloudy day or Big Sur. And I was like, I think Big Sur
not wins. A hard choice. and fortunately, you got it on a day where it's not all on fire. So
yeah, true.
If you're in the room, raise your hand. If you're online, also happy to take questions online. You can use the hand raise icon on Zoom. Or use the chat to type a question in, and I'll look to Lauren to kind of signal if questions come into the chat. But Bill, I saw you get your hand up first.
Thank you so much. It was really fascinating, and the topic that you have addressed has long been on my mind. In fact, as I mentioned this to our speaker right before the seminar, but I had the opportunity before I came to Monterey to be at UCLA, where, among other things, I was in charge of the book series that the Center for International Strategic Affairs published. And one of our early books that came out, I think actually in '81, right after the Asire attack, was by Bennett Ramberg. And it was really the first major study that looked at the attacks on nuclear facilities as kind of Trojan horses in some respects. And what I mentioned earlier was that I got this unusual fax from the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, and they wanted an advanced copy of Bennett's book. This was before the attack, and I didn't save that fax.
This was before Osirak, the 1981 attack?
It was an early 1981, before I think the June attack. So I've been interested ever since in this topic.
Bill, I thought I knew all your anecdotes, but that's a new one. Right?
That's why I'm sharing it with you. But I want to make two basic points. I'm increasingly persuaded by conversations both among parties who have fairly senior positions in the frontier lab space, AI frontier lab space, and with government officials and diplomats in particular in the NPT context, but also beyond that, that the AI companies don't understand nuclear security risks. If they understand anything in the nuclear space, it has to do increasingly, at least with the jargon about a person in the loop and command and control issues. They don't have a clue about the kinds of issues that you're looking at, which I think are vitally important, and they're not really prepared to focus on that issue. And I know that from experience, having tried on behalf of Austria to introduce us into the NPT context, and nobody would touch it. They couldn't even get any language command and control questions into the final NPT draft document. But by the same token, the AI companies don't, well, the AI companies don't understand nuclear risks, and the diplomats don't understand the relevant AI issues. And that was also apparent at the Nuclear Energy and AI Conference in Vienna in December of 2025. With maybe one exception, the Canadians, I think, really got it. But the point that when you're looking at incentives for multilateral collaboration and action, it seems to me that there's one very apparent one that bears some consideration. Because I would argue that particularly the major nuclear suppliers and those countries that are increasingly dependent upon nuclear energy going forward have a very obvious shared interest in preventing any future Chernobyl or Fukushima-like incident. And that seems to me that that would be the basis for at least discussing these matters, whether it's with respect to non-state actors or even with respect to, to state actors, because a Chernobyl-like incident today or Fukushima-like incident today would again cause, literally the meltdown, if you will, of the nuclear industry. So I'm just curious if you looked at that at all. And I know you have your set of case studies, but I think in this regard, China is particularly interesting. And I think they might recognize that and be amenable to some kind of a discussion of these issues, at least in a track 1.5 or track 2 context.
Yeah, no, those are very, very many interesting points. So I appreciate that. And our conversation earlier about Bennett Ramberg, I found absolutely fascinating, and that book and sort of that context as well. I think this point about how AI companies are not understanding risks is understood by people within government more than the point about how diplomats don't understand AI is necessarily filtering into the mindset of companies. And what I mean by that is sort of specifically people working within the nuclear energy sector, so nuclear regulatory bodies, et cetera, do sort of understand that AI cannot be taken in its current form and just adopted into practice. So they're trying to sort of build internal expertise to work on what an internal AI software could look like, where can it be used. And also specifically, there is a practice of making sure that the only people who are able to utilize AI tools for data analysis, even for that point currently, already have the expertise themselves to assess whether it's reasonable, the outcome, and whether that makes sense. So they're really trying to sort of have that human verification currently. And so not to just fully rely on that. And so I have been quite pleased to see that countries are already talking about that and are making sure that AI has a lot of sort of extra regulatory processes surrounding that. Now, in terms of multilateral incentives, I think this is a really good point. I think it's where we could see a lot of movement on it. My PhD doesn't necessarily go there, but I've definitely thought about it quite extensively. In terms of multilateral incentives for better norms generation, because I think this is what it boils down to, is sort of that one of the interesting processes that I sort of heard about recently was whether nuclear suppliers should be sort of either perhaps maintaining control of certain elements within the facilities when they do export control, or at least having verification processes themselves. So for example, if we're looking at, I don't know, I think Nigeria has been looking at nuclear energy, for example, and let's say the US wanted to export a specific technology there, sort of maintaining control of it to at least a certain degree and not just exporting it and turning over. All of that has been something that has been discussed between specific country contexts that are not those two specifically, but it has been discussed. So I think it could be interesting. However, I will say that I think the bigger issue is that there is this understanding that if we talk about attacks on nuclear energy facilities, are we risking them perhaps becoming more of a problem and sort of growing them? There is this perception that the more we talk about it, the more it becomes a strategic tool that could be thought about in a potential attacker toolbox. And so it's about that balance of like, where can we talk about it, but also not talk about it in certain environments where it might end up sort of becoming an idea that was not necessarily an idea before, if that makes sense. I think China would be great. I haven't been able to directly meet with, so I mean, I think from an ideal perspective, like there are a lot of other countries as well. Like for example, Russia would be quite interesting to hear what, like a little bit more about their strategy on certain things. I haven't been able to connect with people there yet, but it is something that I've spoken about a bit because the Chinese nuclear, so CNNC is involved in the UK project. So specifically Hinkley Point C is being developed in partnership with them. And so there's been some conversation about what does that look like where are the differences in how structures are organized. And I think it could be quite interesting to add that to the PhD. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, other questions? Oh. It's almost like a sort of subtle auction, you know, we'll see your bid and raise you 500.
Debating about what it is that I want to say, and so I have three things I want to say. Two are sort of fairly straightforward substantive points, and then one is a sort of overarching one about how to thinking about the broader project. So in terms of the substantive ones, states definitely think about attacking nuclear power plants as part of purported counterproliferation efforts. And the obvious example is 1981 Osirak, which Bill mentioned. Right? And what's interesting about that one is a light water reactor, so it's actually not very proliferation sensitive. It certainly is maybe indirectly proliferation sensitive in the sense that you get used to operating a reactor, but notionally you could put natural uranium within the neutron flux and enrich it, and also it's generating a form of plutonium that's weapons usable, even if not weapons optimal. But heavy water reactors are much more optimal. So that's just sort of one substantive thing I wanted to flag. The second one is I thought this trade-off between offense and defense was really interesting. And you know, one thing that I was thinking was you can make Ukraine's power plants as resilient as you like, and the Russians can still bomb them. In fact, I'm not even sure how much it changes the equation. Like you could build the most resilient power plant in the world, whatever that entails, and a Russian drone can crash into it and damage it. And so that, you know, that sort of the binary trade-off I struggled with a little bit as I was listening to you. The third one is a sort of reflection on British academic norms versus American norms. And this is a little bit naive, but I was thinking about this from an American PhD perspective. And the way I think about an American PhD dissertation is we ask a question about what is the nature of the world? And we put forward falsifiable hypotheses. This is the nature of the world, or that's the nature of the world. And then from that, prescription follows. And this feels to me like a prescriptive project that doesn't do that first part of it. And I think in a British context, that's actually that flies, like that's a mode of British PhDing. But one thing that I thought about is, okay, like if I were advising this and this was an American project, like what would I think about? And I think one way to think about falsifiable hypotheses is the bureaucratic politics literature. Like certain kinds of bureaucracies adjust to disruptive technologies better than others or differently than others, right? That's a hypothesis about the nature of the world. Or the offense-defense balance literature, like certain technologies are defense dominant or offense dominant, like tanks or barbed wire or nuclear weapons, they're big debates. But drones or cyber or all these things, right? How does this affect the offense-defense balance? But I think if you wanted, there are questions here to ask about the nature of the world from which prescription follows. And I didn't hear you do that first part, and I don't think you have to, but I think it's also a project that lends itself quite well to it, right? Like the offense-defense balance or bureaucratic politics or the nature of norms, or there are lots of falsifiable hypotheses that you could make about the nature of the world, and I don't want to sort of tell you how to do your dissertation, and I'm not sure sort of where you are in the process of it, but that, as an American academic, that was in part my reaction.
Before you respond, I might two-finger a little bit on Philip's last point, but I don't want to deflect you from answering all of his questions. But I had a sort of similar question reaction to you, which you know, frame it similar, like in an elite university US PhD program, you know, a dissertation would totally be framed around literature and the contribution to knowledge. Like, here's some theoretical and or methodological literature in my field. Here's some place where there's a puzzle or debate or question, right? And here's where my empirical research is going to answer the question in a way that makes the following contribution to knowledge. And you didn't frame your talk at all that way. And I didn't know if that was because you were pitching it for CNS, but that's not really our interest, or whether that's really a genuine reflection of the dissertation. So, you know, my way of asking a similar question to Philip's is sort of, who are you thinking of as the audience for this? Like, assuming that everything goes well, you finish the dissertation, you pass your viva, you think about where and how you're going to publish it. Ideally in your mind, who is reading this? Are you really trying to write something for a policy-making, regulatory agency operator community, or are you really trying to write something that is a sort of future, university press book?
Yeah, no, thank you. This is great feedback. And I also just want to quickly mention that your first 2 points as well, I think were really helpful. So I appreciate that. Yes, there is the proliferation. I mean, when my PhD, when I do talk about attacks for proliferation, I do discuss sort of that balance between whether there was how large the proliferation was. I do touch on that when discussing sort of whether to include certain cases or not. So that's a completely valid point. Offense versus defense literature is actually a great idea in terms of sort of putting that in there. Now, in terms of the final point, because I really think that's quite fascinating as well, is actually with regards to the presentation, I cut out that bit because I didn't know exactly I didn't know how much time to spend on it, but I think it's a really great, I completely agree on it. So the PhD itself, that's what I was saying, is like a specific subset of the PhD, the bits that I cut out. So I sort of cut out the in-between methodology was actually quite a bit longer, but just felt like it would take too long to sort of get into it. The question originally was, how do state actors effectively reduce security risks at nuclear energy facilities in advance of attacks? So specifically, when I look at that, I'm looking across a few different literature sets. I look at the international norms literature set and whether those norms are able to be tied into or have been discussed in any sort of strategic doctrines or responses with regards to historical attacks, and whether there's any sort of conceptualization with regards to that, as well as current incidents. So that ends up tying in sort of a bit there. But I also significantly look at risk-based literature, and I'm looking specifically at sort of literature with regards to risk prevention mechanisms, deterrence mechanisms, etc. And so that literature review ends up asking the question of whether where risk is currently being looked at, which is, let's say, in this resilience space, is the correct moment to be looking at risk, and whether it needs to be either being moved earlier in the process or after, as you correctly noticed, like with the attack in, if there is a drone attack, actually, yeah, that was your point, yeah. If there is a drone attack that occurs, is this enough to prevent it? Possibly not, right? So where else could that actually be within sort of the frameworks that exist currently in terms of strategy? So I look sort of extensively at that, and then I'm sort of adding into that theory space that there is sort of a gap and where some of this comes in. In terms of the 4 frameworks over there, it was a result of the field work. Again, sort of, I guess, the way I presented it, kind of shortcut there, but it's a result of the field research, because when I went to the field research, I went in saying, okay, how are you strategizing? How are you thinking about this? Are there gaps? Are there effectiveness gaps? And also specifically, at what stage are you thinking about this in traditional risk response frameworks? And as I spoke to people, these were the 4 things that were being raised on repeat. These were the 4 sort of areas that conversation came up on, and people in government were considering them or talking about sort of their overall risk reduction strategy in the concept of these 4 internally. Obviously, that doesn't mean that a specific agency was looking at all 4, but these are the themes that sort of emerged as sort of generally being agreed upon, that some level of strategy had to be occurring across this. So it's sort of this specific presentation was trying to look specifically at a portion of my PhD, which is the emerging technology element. So I think I kind of shortcut some of the literature, unfortunately, but that's something I would love to discuss more offline at some point and get feedback on.
All right, other questions? Lauren, anybody online posting anything?
Maybe we would see like hands pop up on the screen.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I have a question when talking about, for example, where the risk is currently being looked at or potential risks. I know it's probably like a very specific example, but for example, I know that in Southern California, in San Onofre, there had been a decommissioning of a nuclear power plant, but there's conversations of the risks of the nuclear waste that's being stored within the facility, even though it was shut down in 2013. Do you know, or have you seen any research that touch upon the concerns or risks of flaws of nuclear power plants decommissioning?
Yeah, so actually, this is something that's come up in a few different ways in my research. So there is a site in the UK as well, Sellafield, that's been undergoing kind of an extensive decommissioning process. And when it started, because the UK apparatus has sort of been in existence for, I don't know, like the past 80-ish years, I think at this point, but when it started, they didn't necessarily have the same standards that exist today in terms of how to handle things. And so there are certain things today that are now being looked back on and they say, okay, this could have been managed better. So for example, with safety, there's certain elements of how specific pools were handled, and now it could be improved upon based on modern standards. Now, in terms of security risk is not something that I would say is as giant. Like if we try to break that into sort of thinking about like safety and safeguard risk and security risk, I don't think security risk there is that prominent because first of all, it's not the most attractive target. And then also in terms of actual sort of side effects, yes, there is some level of radiation risk, fire risk, et cetera, but it's again, not necessarily sort of the main focus. But in terms of safeguard risk, that's been something I think is sort of largely explored because there is a risk still that some of those materials could potentially contain elements that are potentially usable if treated correctly. So that's where there's been a lot of new strategy coming out on how to do that. And I don't know if that gets to your question, but I don't think security specifically has ended up being sort of a major player within the decommissioning sense. Obviously, there's security to some degree, but I just don't think it's sort of as much of a risk currently.
No, yeah, it does answer my question. I just wanted to understand if there was a security risks behind it. So thank you so much.
I don't want to say that it doesn't exist, but like there is one, but it's just not to the same degree that other sites pose.
Thank you.
You know, I could imagine a terrorist group wanting to, blow up a spent fuel pond and scatter radioactivity locally, but in terms of especially for states, there's not much interest there because it's not, there's nothing you can divert to a nuclear weapons program or something like that.
Yeah,
so.
And it's not really disruptive for civilian life or way of life either, right? Because with the nuclear energy facilities, part of it as well could be energy disruption, but with the decommissioning facilities, it wouldn't necessarily be disruptive.
I mean, it's an in-place dirty bomb. So if you bomb a site that has significant spent fuel, you would create a Chernobyl-like contamination. But so it's a form of horrific cost imposition that hopefully norms are strong enough.
Yeah. So maybe I'll exercise chair's prerogative and ask you a question. Then I see Shiraj, I'll get to you next. So, to the extent that you have a sort of larger theoretical literature that you're framing within it, it seems as you're sort of coming into the norms literature, which I think works fine for this topic. But I see your work making an assumption that I'm not sure that you can validate with the research you did. So, with security risks, right, we can think about it either from an attacker's point of view or a defender's point of view, and you're really working from the defender's point of view. What can states and operators do to improve, to harden nuclear power plants so that they're more secure against the kinds of threats that come under the nuclear security umbrella? And you had a hypothesis that you put in the terms of this resilience, or what the E was now, escalation paradox, that in a way, improving protections around nuclear facilities makes attacks lower consequence. And ironically, the very fact that they're lower consequence makes them in some ways more attractive because we're assuming attackers don't want to cross some threshold of damage that would bring down, too much backlash or state reaction or international opprobrium on them. But I'm wondering if that's actually empirically true. Like my intuition is just the norms are weakening. Right. That when Russia attacks Zaporizhia, right, it's not because they think, oh, they've really improved the security of Zaporizhia. We can hit some of those, reactor domes and not do that much damage, but it's still sort of psychologically scary, right? And I think it's just that Russia's blown off all norms, right, and they don't care anymore. I don't think it changes actually in terms of like policy advice that comes out of your dissertation. I don't think it changes it at all. You're going to make the exact same set of recommendations either way. But I'm just wondering if what's the evidence for sort of your version of this kind of paradox versus just norms are weakening?
No, I think that's a really good point. So actually, when I've looked at it in a historical sense, the norms haven't been strong to start with on potential. So it's like, yes, it sort of presumably they are weakening, but it's not within the range of, okay, there were really strong norms and it's what was preventing the attacks to now they've weakened and now it's not. It's more within the context of previously, what seems to have been some of the doctrines and statements around it is that the potential environmental consequences were perceived as being far more harmful, and now it's perceived as being sort of more limited in scale, or more that, or countries, even if it's not limited in scale, countries sort of think about it as something that they can get away with within what the other types of attacks that go on currently. And so it's one of those things where it's sort of, it's normative in a sense, but it's also in a sense that it wasn't ever, often the attacking country could be quite close to the location they're attacking, and there's the idea of blowback, and there's like these other elements that are sort of, and they might also have nuclear energy facilities themselves and be quite concerned about their own security. So it's been like other elements of sort of more strategic than norms is sort of one of the arguments that I make that has sort of existed even historically as protecting these facilities. Which is then if we're like, okay, so the norms have always been slightly weak or not necessarily the only mechanism working here. If there is this sort of environmental element that's sort of also played a role, then how does that interplay with the types of strategies that are being used currently? And so looking at that interplay of like, okay, if resilience is improving or if the way that this perception of these facilities is improving, which is great, is that also reducing the perception that these facilities offer a certain amount of security threat that's just something that they cannot bear as a strategy. And that interrelation seems to be sort of either, first of all, in terms of doctrines and also decision making, it seems to potentially be there. Obviously, I've not been able to directly talk to someone and say, okay, why did you decide to attack a nuclear energy facility? But you know, within there, it seems to be there. But then in terms of the defending point of view, as you spoke about, so focusing on that defender point of view, it seems to be in the thinking of defenders of like, this is maybe what's happening and how do we think about it? And so it's sort of thinking about like, the perspective that's happening is we are using resilience enabling technologies and resilience enabling strategies, and it doesn't seem to necessarily always be working, but you know, where is the growth in that space? And so that's specifically what it's looking at in terms of the data.
Okay. It reminds me a little bit, we were talking, you know, before about the nuclear weapons testing debates in the 50s and 60s, where so much of the discourse focused on the public health risks of radioactive fallout, rather than, you know, on testing per se as you know, maybe having a negative, you know, cost benefit effect in terms of enabling nuclear arms racing and proliferation and stuff. It's, once people figured out the technology of moving, you know, nuclear testing underground and ending the fallout problem, all of the public pressure went away, right? So you're seeing something similar here, I think, where the framing around environmental public health effects enables people to do things that, you know, if they stay below the threshold that arouses criticism, they can sort of feel like they can get away with it. So I do see some parallels.
Can I two-finger on this really quickly before we move on? Because I know Sharad is impatient. So I think a really interesting dynamic here that I just want to sort of put a pin in for you is the interaction between the material world and the norms. Like the material characteristics of these offensive and defensive systems and their implications for norms. That's a really interesting thing that like you might think about leaning into, because like that you talked about that, but a little bit obliquely. So I just want to flag that. I think there's a theoretical thing there that's really interesting to hash out.
Can you put me on your list? I have a two-finger, but I don't want to.
Yeah, so we'll do Sharad, we'll go back to Bill, and then I'll make sure that there's nobody else before we hit the.
Okay. I think what is important in your work, but it also complicates addressing a number of these questions, is the distinction between the motivations of the non-state actors and the state actors. Because I think when you're talking about non-state actors, the notion of, you know, hardening the facilities is almost irrelevant, because you're talking about a very different set of motivations on the part of historically, you know, state actors. They don't think of their activities, I think, as militarily driven, whereas that may be the case for state actors. So we can talk more about this, you know, afterwards. But I think to address the offense-defense kind of issue, it's a very different set of questions that you want to consider, and the impact of norms with respect to non-state actors who may be almost disinterested in the normative issues and states because of the motivations of the different players.
No, absolutely. And so, in answer to that, my PhD uses non-state actors as sort of as as additional information as a sort of a comparable, but it focuses on state actors in part because of this, because it's hard to set normative responses, and also it's hard to assume that every or a lot of non-state actors are going to be rational actors. So when we start talking about rationality and like whether norms are enough to predict a certain set of behaviors, it immediately just goes into the state realm, especially with regards to ideological extremists, where it would be hard to.
But the importance is that, at least in my view, when you're talking about nuclear security, the impact of AI is much greater with respect to non-state actors in terms of empowering them than it is in altering the behavior and the capabilities of state actors. That's enough.
Dr. Joshi.
It reminds me of your Four Faces book, Bill.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, the motivations and non-state actors, remember that. This was great. I think I'll just echo what some of my colleagues have said, that, or at least what I got out of it, that, I mean, there's definitely a gap in the literature here. So, the literature bit is, you gotta work on that, I suppose. But I like the connection between emerging technologies and the civilian nuclear side of things. Because from what I've seen, there's been relatively little research on that, especially in some of the case studies, certainly the India one. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about some of the cases of the last few years, like, I'm sure you've covered it already in your work, but there was a suspected North Korean attack on one of the civilian power plants in Tamil Nadu. This was maybe, I don't know, 2018, 19 or so. And I think Devak Das wrote some stuff on this. The other point which I thought was really interesting was the norms bit. That what is this? How does it get us to think about international norms? Whether you can, test it one way or the other. But as Jeff said, intuitively, yes, they do seem to be weakening. I don't want to add to the case studies that you might want to look at, but I think some of the countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, are the ones that have been really interested in civilian nuclear energy. And our colleague Robert Shaw, I think he's done some really interesting stuff on this, from what I remember. So I think those might be worth looking at also, just as an aside, to see what that can tell you for your existing cases. And just on the India case, I think a couple of things that came to my mind. One was over the last year or so, there's been some increasing talk about some really highly qualified people leaving some of the scientific organizations, and especially the Indian Space Research Organization. So apparently there's been a spate of them. I don't know the exact numbers. And so it's been enough that it's caused some worry for the government. I'm not saying they're insider threats, but I think it also, and especially the fact that they're leaving for the private sector, and there's been this growth of various startups in India, both on the space side, but also to some extent, I think on the nuclear side, you'll know better. So I think that interaction from the human knowledge perspective, I think that might be worth thinking about. The other part was from the legislative side. Again, I was thinking about this from the India case, because I mean, it's been over 2 decades since the US-India nuclear agreement, but there haven't been any actual civilian nuclear deals that have been signed between US and Indian companies. And part of the hitch has been on the legislative side, because I think years ago the Indian Parliament put in place all sorts of regulations, and so there's been some talk over the last, I think, 6 months to try to work around that or fix that. But it'd be interesting to see how, in the different cases, what the legislations are, what the hitches are, especially when you're looking at, say, newer actors coming onto the scene from the private side. The other point I think we briefly discussed this before the seminar, the civil military stuff. I'd be interested in thinking about what the Indian government or the Indian military has been thinking when it comes to, attacks, in Pakistan, especially from the nuclear side, whether it is purposeful or inadvertent or what. And that I think to a large extent is a function of the peculiar or the specific civil military structure in India when it comes to security decision making and on the nuclear side versus say Pakistan or any other country.
So, Sharad, do you want to say anything about the India-Pakistan confidence building agreement not to target each other's nuclear facilities?
Tired about this. I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't actually read much about it for years and years. It's sort of gone under the radar. It's still there. I think every Jan 1st they exchange their lists. And one of the things that we were chatting earlier was a public opinion on this issue, and I sort of contrast this with, say, the Indus Waters Treaty between the two countries, which was under the auspices of the World Bank. And then after the last crisis, India walked out of the Indus Waters Treaty, and but that also became part of the public imagination. Whether, I don't fully understand the Indus Waters Treaty, but I know what it is. And I don't think there's been a similar push into the public conversation about these CBMs. So it'd be interesting to see what the public opinion would be on nuclear CBMs. But there's a couple of these CBMs, the non-attack agreement and then the missile test notification pact, which doesn't cover cruise missiles, only ballistic. But that's not going to move forward. I'm just surprised that there haven't been calls, at least in India, to withdraw from some of these nuclear CBMs.
That's what I was wondering, was like whether they're really still in place.
They're in place. Yeah, they're in
They
place.
think of them as being in place.
Every Jan 1st, there's a small, story in the papers that, hey, they've exchanged lists, but.
It would be an interesting way to maybe differentiate weakening norms versus steady norms, but changing technology. Like, would there be, if there was some incident between India and Pakistan involving some kind of incident with a nuclear power plant, would they think of it as like, well, we don't care about the norm anymore? Would they think it about like, oh, well, that agreement never covered this kind of attack? Like, now we've got cyber, that's never what we meant. So, fingers crossed it doesn't happen and you don't have the empirical case to study, but if it did, that might be one that would help you separate out those two different hypotheses a little bit.
Yeah. No, that was a lot of really, really interesting thoughts and feedback. And I'm trying to figure out like what specifically to focus on. Southeast Asian case studies are very interesting. I will mention that. I did come across the DPRK attack at, everything was couldn't call them a plant, but it was, there's that, and there's also been recent insider threat incidences as well that have also been quite interesting in the Indian case specifically. I think in terms of responding, great comments across the board. I think one of the things that you mentioned is the legislative element, which is something that I do look at quite extensively, specifically in the Indian context. Once the 123 agreement went into place, they've sort of put in a law about liability, which would hold a company entirely liable for any nuclear accidents at a nuclear energy company, at a nuclear energy site, which is something that a company cannot actually pay for. They don't have the financial ability to do that. And in most countries, it's sort of a government or a blended responsibility for how to handle that. And so that liability law, some people say, was in part because they wanted to discourage foreign companies from entering at that stage. They just wanted, what the real goal of the 123 agreement, one argument is to get access to uranium for the civilian nuclear power plants, because India was sort of uranium poor at the time. Now, fast forward to this past year in December, India put out the Shanti Act, which is, I think, quite exciting because it enables and sort of looks at expanding the nuclear sector, but it also has asked for sort of a new liability format to be put into place in India to enable foreign companies to come in. And specifically, they want to sort of look at sort of some of the more advanced reactor builds, et cetera, coming from abroad. So I do think we could see some significant change in terms of that. But I do think legislation is sort of, and across all 4 of these case studies, there have been major legislative changes in the past 3 years, which has actually been quite inconvenient for my PhD, where it'd be great if things stayed at like one status. There's that. The non-attack agreement. I think it's actually a really impressive example of sort of a CBM that's ongoing regardless of India and Pakistan being at war, having attacks, whatever. Every Jan 1st, that agreement list is exchanged, and then there's always a PR release, as you were noticing, like a very small PR release saying we exchanged the list, and that's pretty much it. That's all the information the public gets. That said, what happened last year with the Pahalgam terror attack in India, so the terrorists came into India and sort of attacked people, and then as a response, India responded with strikes in Pakistan on the terrorist areas, et cetera, back and forth, escalates to a point at which India targets a facility in Pakistan where there's allegedly some nuclear interest to a degree. It's debated on what exactly was going on at that site. Immediately, India says that they did not know that that site was a nuclear site. And so they immediately are showing that they would, in theory, respect this norm of not knowing that the site was a nuclear site. Now, of course, whether they knew and still hit as a way of escalation is an extremely large question that I think people have discussed quite extensively. But that happens, and then India sort of stops the Indus River water treaty, which means that the control of the Indus River flowing into Pakistan. So Pakistan's short on water and especially fresh water supply. And there is conversation within Pakistan of suspending all agreements with India at that point. And then fast forwarding to sort of the end of the year with regards to this non-attack agreement, to bring it back to this, there was concern about whether that agreement would go through, whether that exchange list would go through. I don't know if it was serious concern, but there was some level of concern about that. It went through as normal. And so that's quite impressive that even with discussions of suspending every treaty and what that would look like, this just happened as normal. So, yeah.
Okay, I see Noor has a hand up online. Go ahead, Noor, unmute.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's so much information and really good information. I don't know how and what to do with the information, but it's definitely helpful for my thesis. I want to ask specifically in terms of non-state actors, where do you draw the line, or how do you distinguish between policy that's not working and hardening this non-state actor versus deterring them? And usually it's one of two, and usually the policy doesn't change because it's been a policy by different administrations or different bodies. So I just wanted to get more information specifically on the hardening versus deterring policy.
Sorry, I couldn't quite catch the first word. The what versus the deterrence policy? Hardening policy. Thank you.
Resilience.
Okay, great, perfect. In terms of non-state actors specifically, I mean, it's a bit of an interesting one. I mean, if non-state actors are not necessarily going to be engaged on the types of norms that underpin traditional deterrence, so that's where hardening, I think, just plays an entirely strong role, specifically with non-state actors. With state actors is where we start talking about other elements that are used to sort of deter and prevent these attacks. With non-state actors specifically, the idea is sort of twofold. One is, if an attack, how do we make these sites so unattractive to attack that non-state actors are not going to attack them? And so how do we make it so difficult to attack that there are so many lower, to be entirely honest, other sites that are easier to attack that these sites are just not at risk? So that's one element that goes through in terms of strategy. And then the other element that goes through in terms of strategy is also how do we make sure that even if an attack were to occur, nothing would happen. So even if they tried to carry out an attack for some reason, nothing would happen. And I think like there are interesting examples of that when we look at politically motivated groups in Argentina and South Africa and attacks that happened in those in like the 90s and 80s and 90s. It's sort of interesting to see how those facilities were trying to be built to sort of that even if something were to happen, there would be no major consequences. So I think those are the two elements that we see with non-state actors specifically, more so than thinking through how can we make sure that how can we like put pressure on them, some sort of normative pressure on them not to do this. That's less of a mechanism with non-state actors specifically.
And I would add, as the person who sort of teaches our deterrence seminar here, that those preventive hardening efforts can have a dual intent. So they can both be like, let's make the defenses really hard. So hopefully if a terrorist group, or other non-state actor tries something, it either fails or has minimum consequences. But doing that is also a version of deterrence. It's deterrence by denial, right? You'll see that there's so low chance of benefits from attacking, you'll be dissuaded from attacking in the first place. So that can be part of a deterrence strategy as well. And that is, I mean, in US Homeland Security, the phrase was always sort of prevention and deterrence, as if it was like all one word, because prevention generates a certain amount of deterrence by denial. Jean, you had a question?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and good luck with your rest of your PhD. I have a sort of mine is more of a comment. And that's about what you're suggesting, that there's a kind of an erosion against the norm on attack on nuclear facilities. And I kind of like to see this in kind of in terms of the oughtness of norms. I mean, norms are difficult to sometimes define. I mean, you can define norms in terms of treaties or decisions taken. So in this case, I mean, I can only think on the non-attack agreement between India and Pakistan, and there's a clause in the Pelindaba Treaty on the nuclear weapons-free zone, which is obviously applicable to the parties to that treaty. And then there is the IAEA General Conference resolution. But there's an oughtness, what is proper behavior. And I think that proper behavior, and I was struck this morning, we had in this very room, I have a virtual summer school for Latin American diplomats. And one of our top experts on the Middle East, Dr. Chen Kane, spoke on Iran, and I asked her the question about the concerns about attacking the Bushehr power plant in Iran. And she said, there's actually been, it seems like there's been a clear, conscious decision not to do so, which suggests to me that the norm is upheld. We've seen Iran attacking a Saudi reactor or facility. Now, whether that was a targeted attack or was that just in the fog of war, but then you also see Zaporizhia. Well, again, I don't think that was a targeted attack against a power plant. That was also kind of the only other two that I can think of is the Al-Kibar reactor that Syria tried to build, that the Israelis bombed or destroyed, which was not fueled, and Osirak, which was also not fueled. So that was preemptive. That was, and you just in passing, and I didn't ask to take the floor because you mentioned the South African case. That was a very isolated individual that wanted to impress the ANC leadership that he can take a couple of pipe bombs and plant it and see if he can. That was not even sanctioned by the ANC. So I'm just wondering whether is there really an erosion of this norm that we see, and if you maybe explore that in detail, what is the norm? What are the norm indicators, and is there such erosion?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and it gets to that thing about, are the norms weakening or have they always been weak? And I think so I think they've always been to a certain degree weak, but where there has been a norm, it's sort of on attacks where there's fissile material on the site. So if you are looking at a civilian nuclear power plant that's operating and has significant amounts of fissile material, there has been a norm because of the potential for environmental radioactive consequences on nearby civilians. In the attacks, especially the Osirak attack is very interesting because it's sort of the first time Israel had attacked Osirak. But what's interesting about that is originally there was a lot of outcry about what Israel had done and saying that this is not, and then Israel sort of explained it as this non-proliferation mechanism, and that was the intent. And also, what's also very interesting about statements at that time is that they mention on repeat the fact that there was no fissile material at the site, and that becomes like this really prominent part of, if there's no fissile material, then maybe this doesn't have a norm applying to it at all, or to any sort of the similar degree. So if we take that as sort of being the norm that doesn't exist, then we can assume that the norm that does exist is now related to this fissile materials at a site. So then what we see recently is that even if there's fissile materials at a site, certain sorts of security behavior and military behavior near a site that would not have happened previously. So in Zaporizhia, whether we're saying the attack was intended to be on the plant. There have been attacks intended to be on supplementary buildings. There have been decisions made that put the plant at risk in a way that would not have necessarily occurred before. So maybe there's an element there that can be argued that there's some normative weakening. That said, even with all of these decisions, the environmental consequences from what's happened at Zaporizhzhia so far have thankfully been quite minimal. And that's something that I think if there were decisions to be made that would have a more severe environmental consequence, there'd be more pressure against that than keeping it within a realm where we're not seeing it to the same degree. So yeah, I think it varies so much on like a case and very nuanced basis. And it is something where I sort of like break the norm down into all of these like little nuances and say sort of how strong I think these different elements are. And part of saying how we can figure out how strong they are is looking at these historic case studies, a part of it as well as looking at doctrines and also how state actors currently within their own governments and strategies are thinking about these norms as existing.
The final word, I think.
Oh, okay. So I think, without going into detail on the number of different occasions in which civilian nuclear facilities were attacked in Ukraine, which are well beyond Zaporizhzhia. I think it's not just a question of the behavior of states in terms of attacking, it's the reaction of the international community to these attacks. And that's where I see the norm definitely weakened, whether it's at the IAEA or in other international fora. So, I mean, I would make the argument in that case, in that fashion, rather than in terms of the actual number of attacks on facilities.
More the acceptance that this is.
Yeah, exactly. And it is kind of more standard operating practice.
All right, final two fingers.
So I just want to observe that there's a potential paradox where a stronger norm enables a stronger signal. And I think about this in particular in the India-Pakistan context. So I could imagine, and I'm just imagining it, that if India-Pakistan escalated up the ladder, Pakistan in particular might strike an Indian power plant as a way that was short of using nuclear weapons, that was less provocative than using nuclear weapons, as a way to send the signal like, you crossed a red line for us, and we're doing this thing that's very costly, including for us, like it's risky for Pakistan, to send a signal to try to, as we sometimes say, escalate to de-escalate. And so the fact that you attack a nuclear power plant, I think doesn't automatically mean the norm is weak. It might paradoxically actually mean the norm is strong, because that enables you to send a costly signal, right? You're doing something that's very normatively problematic that incurs costs for you. And so I just want to flag that. And this is sort of notional, but I mean, I don't know that I think the Russians have done that they have engaged in behavior around Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia and these other locations to send a signal, but I don't think it's a totally crazy interpretation. And I think costly signaling is a really interesting dynamic in international politics. And so anyway, there's another paradox there that I just wanted to flag.
Well, Janani, one sign of an extremely successful talk is that you get questions and audience engagement right up to the second hand hitting the hard stop time for the seminar. So thank you very much, and let's congratulate our speaker again.